Pathfinder Remaster. Is it everything we wanted, or just more of the same? Our brutally honest review of the Player Core Rulebook.
Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Last week, we got our digital copy of the Player Core for the new Pathfinder Remaster project. We'd like to give you our first impressions about it as we've read through it, but before we do so, leave us a like and subscribe so we can keep making review videos that's not about D&D products.
Help me help you.
So, what did we think about the Player Core Rulebook? Well, honestly, Paizo's Pathfinder Remaster project is off to a strong start with a new Player Core Rulebook that's much better organized than its predecessor. The new rulebook seems to be a much less intimidating entry point for Pathfinder with less classes and less peripheral content for readers to get lost from. At the same time, Paizo used the re-release to not only revise some of its rules, some of which has sparked some major controversy with fans, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but also firmly break away from Dungeons & Dragons once and for all. First, what is Pathfinder Remaster? It's a new project designed to strip out content from the Pathfinder rule system that originated from the open game license controlled by Wizards of the Coast. You may remember that Pathfinder originally was a derivative rule system built off of the foundation of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition. Now in 2019, Paizo released a new edition of the game that felt very different from Dungeons & Dragons mechanically, but still had some similarities. Now all of this was allowed under the open game license created by Wizards of the Coast in the early 2000s, which you may remember from that big controversy earlier this year, allowed people to use the Dungeons & Dragons rule set and bits of its lore in their own games without any threat of legal action. When Wizards of the Coast tried to essentially revoke the open game license earlier this year, Paizo acted quickly, announcing its own open game license, the Open RPG Creative License, or ORC for short, and announcing a project to firmly break away from the legacy Dungeons & Dragons content baked within its games. Now, for some context on how I approach this review, I personally am a Pathfinder 2nd Edition Game Master. I've been running a campaign for about 6 months, and I've also been covering the game since its release and have read every single rulebook. Now, despite having some experience in the game, I'd say my Pathfinder knowledge is about middling when it comes to the rules. I'm hardly a rules expert, and I haven't run a session yet where I haven't had to look at the Archives of Nethys, which is a great digital compendium of all the Pathfinder rules, like at least a half dozen times. More importantly, I've never played Pathfinder as a player, so some of the character building nuances are kind of lost on me because I've never had a chance to really do that. So, I mostly compared how this book presented Pathfinder compared to the original Core Rulebook in terms of presentation and ease of understanding, instead of trying to figure out every little thing that changed. So the good news is the chassis of Pathfinder 2nd Edition remains mostly unchanged in Pathfinder Remaster. While ability scores have been replaced by attributes, which means you get a +1 to strength instead of a 12 strength score, which frankly is easier to understand, and the alignment system has been removed from the game and replaced by an edicts and anathema, I can never say that word right, system that's much more attuned to modern RPGs. There aren't too many other major rule changes that really impact the core gameplay. You still roll a d20 to make checks, you still take 3 actions on a turn in combat, and there are a host of mechanics describing exactly how certain actions work within the game system. The biggest changes, at least as I was reading through it, are to the spells and feats, many of which were retooled and renamed to separate them from legacy spells or mechanics that originated from Dungeons & Dragons. If you're a more casual Pathfinder player, you might not even notice the majority of the mechanical changes, although the Pathfinder diehards have already begun to list the thousands of small ways that Pathfinder Remaster is different from Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, the interesting part of Pathfinder Remaster is what content the designers chose to include in the new Core Rulebook. This includes a smaller list of core classes. There are 8 in the Player Core compared to 12 in the 2019 Core Rulebook, and an expanded list of ancestries that include not only the Goblin, which is kind of an iconic Pathfinder character, but also the Orc, the Leshy, and a collection of versatile ancestries that can be used with any ancestry. Making versatile ancestries, this includes like the Nephilim, an ancestry that replaces the Tiefling and Aasimar, and the Dromar, which replaces half-orcs. Now, making these versatile ancestries a core part of the game emphasizes some of the adaptability and flexibility of Pathfinder and shows one of the biggest ways that Pathfinder character creation differs from other fantasy rule systems. Also, I love the fact that new players to the game will have the ability to play as an immortal plant spirit, which is much cooler, in my opinion, than being a boring old dwarf. Now, Pathfinder Remaster also represents an opportunity to rework some of the flaws or the weak points in the rule set, with the Witch class being the first class to get a major overhaul. The mechanics behind the Witch, which is kind of like a warlock, a class that gets their magic through a patron instead of through study or innate ability, has been fundamentally upgraded, and it has turned the class into a viable choice and provided it with a unique space within the Pathfinder rule set. We're not going to dig too much into the Witch here, but I highly recommend that you give it a look because it's pretty cool. Now, future rulebooks released as part of this Pathfinder Remaster project will include other reworked classes, and I'm really curious to see how other underbaked classes get upgraded. Now, I have to talk about one strange rules quirk that's found in the Player Core rulebook, and that is the change to the wounded condition, which is part of how Pathfinder handles dying. There have been some inconsistencies in the rules on how the wounded condition interacts with the dying condition, although most players followed the rules found in the 2019 Core Rulebook, which makes sense because, that's the main rulebook. However, the new Player Core Rulebook makes clear that the 2019 Core Rulebook was wrong. And in fact, dying is now a lot more deadly in the revised rule set. Keep in mind that dying in Pathfinder was already a lot more deadly than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Honestly, this one kind of stands out as a baffling choice. I understand that this might have been the original game design, but we've had 4 years of 95% of Pathfinder players using the rules one way, and they're going to keep using that way. Also, if a lot of players decide to use this new rule set, it's going to have a monumental impact on a lot of campaigns because it's going to significantly increase the player character body count. I don't get this one. I'm not a fan of it, and I talk to my players, and they all want to ignore it. So the major downside to Pathfinder Remaster and the Player Core Rulebook, if you could call it that, is that it's still Pathfinder. If you didn't like 2nd edition, you're not going to like this book. You're not going to like these rules because it's still Pathfinder 2nd edition. Pathfinder proudly wears its crunchy rule sets on its sleeve. It's one of the charms of the game, and that hasn't changed at all with the new re-release. They haven't streamlined the system at all, and that's fine. While I've been a fan of Pathfinder since my first forays into tabletop gaming, I played Rise of the Rune Lords. That was the very first campaign that I ever ran. I do feel that its more complicated rule set kind of limits its appeal to the ever-growing tabletop RPG playing populace. However, I do think that reading through the Player Core Rulebook is one of the best ways of actually understanding the nuances of the game, and honestly, I don't think it's that difficult to understand, especially if you have the rulebook right in front of you. And the Player Core Rulebook, it has implemented a lot of lessons that Paizo has learned in some of its previous products, and they've all been implemented in this Core Rulebook. Overall, I think that the Player Core is a solid rulebook and a good foundation for future Pathfinder players. I'm not sure how many existing Pathfinder players are going to exactly rush out to buy these books. Actually, honestly, I think a lot of them probably will because Pathfinder players tend to be a little bit more rules obsessed than other players, but I do think that this book adequately does its job of explaining the rules of Pathfinder in an easy to follow way. And also, I think it's actually an upgrade on the 2019 Core Rulebook in a number of ways, and I think that's the entire point. So we like the Pathfinder Remaster Player Core Rulebook. Let us know what your thoughts are in the comment section, and again, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.